I never thought one ordinary evening would change the way I looked at love, family, and even myself. I was 17, still caught between being a child who depended on her mother for everything and a young woman who was learning how complicated the world really was. My mother had always been my rock, the one person who seemed unshakable no matter what storms life threw at us. But that night, I stumbled onto something I never expected, something that left me breathless and confused. I caught her in the act, an act I wasn't prepared to see, one that tore away the picture-perfect idea I thought I had of her. Yet, as shocking as it was, it became the beginning of a story that shaped me in ways I couldn't have imagined. It started quietly. The house felt unusually warm that night. My mother thought I was asleep, tucked away in my room after another exhausting day at school. But I wasn't. I had been tossing and turning, restless with thoughts about my future, my friends, my uncertain place in the world. The walls in our small home weren't thick, and sometimes whispers carried through the hallways. That night, I heard a laugh, a woman's laugh that wasn't my mother's. My curiosity stirred immediately, not because my mom never had company, she did, but because of the way she laughed back. It was different, softer, almost shy. I remember creeping out of my room, bare feet on the cool floor, moving silently like a guilty child who knew she shouldn't be prying. The living room light glowed faintly against the dark hallway, and that's when I saw them, my mother and another woman, close, too close for what I understood at the time. Their bodies leaned into each other, their eyes locked in a way that didn't need words. And then, without hesitation, my mother kissed her. My heart hammered against my chest so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. It was as if my world had been pulled from under me. I wasn't disgusted, but I was confused, scared even, because in that moment my mother became a stranger. She wasn't just my mom anymore, she was a woman with secrets, with a life I hadn't been invited to know. I stumbled back before they could notice me, retreating to my room, the image burned into my mind. Lying on my bed, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I tried to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. My mom had never spoken about dating anyone, never even hinted at liking someone, let alone a woman. Growing up, people always made it seem like love only happened one way, between a man and a woman. But what I saw in her eyes, the way she held that woman, wasn't fake. It wasn't something wrong. It was real, maybe even more real than anything I had ever seen before. Still, I couldn't shake the betrayal I felt. Why hadn't she told me? Why was she hiding this part of herself from me, the person who loved her most? Sleep never came that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, every detail sharper than the last, the gentle curve of her smile, the nervous way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the sound of her laughter when that woman whispered something I couldn't hear. And for the first time I realized how little I truly knew about her. I had always seen her as just my mom, the woman who worked hard to pay the bills, who worried about my grades, who reminded me to eat breakfast before school. But now I had seen the woman behind the mother, and it left me unsettled. Morning came too quickly, sunlight spilling through my curtains as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I dragged myself out of bed, eyes heavy with the weight of my thoughts. When I walked into the kitchen, she was there, making coffee like any other day, her face calm, composed. But I couldn't unsee what I saw. My stomach knotted with questions I didn't know how to ask. Should I confront her? Should I pretend like nothing happened? I watched her move around the kitchen, and for the first time, I noticed her differently, like a woman carrying stories I had never heard. I sat at the table, forcing a smile when she greeted me, but my voice caught in my throat. She looked at me, and for a moment, I wondered if she knew I had seen everything. Maybe she could see it in my eyes, the way I avoided hers. She poured me a glass of juice and asked if I slept well, and all I could do was nod, my heart heavy with unspoken words. The day dragged on, each moment thick with the weight of my secret. At school, I couldn't focus. My friends laughed, chatted, and gossiped around me, but I felt disconnected, like I was carrying a truth too heavy to share. I wanted to confide in someone, but who could I tell? This wasn't just about me, it was about her, about us, about the kind of bond that could shatter if I handled it wrong. When I got home, she was waiting, sitting on the couch with a look in her eyes I couldn't read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was almost as if she had decided something. She patted the seat next to her and said softly, "We need to talk." My throat tightened. Maybe she knew. Maybe she felt the shift too. My heart raced as I sat beside her, bracing myself for whatever truth was about to come out. My body stiffened as I sat down beside her, unsure of what was about to unfold. The air between us felt different, heavier than usual, like every second was thick with a truth we were both too scared to touch. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at them for a long moment before finally lifting her gaze to me. Her eyes were soft, but there was something vulnerable hiding in them, something I had never seen before. It struck me that my mother, the woman who had always seemed so strong and unbreakable, was suddenly fragile in front of me. That alone was enough to make my chest ache. She cleared her throat, her voice low when she began. "I don't know how much you've seen, or how much you've figured out," she said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones over a river she could drown in. "But there are things about me I haven't told you. Not because I wanted to keep them from you, but because I didn't know how." I sat frozen, my palms sweating, my heartbeat racing so hard it hurt. Every part of me wanted to scream out that I had seen everything, that I knew what she was hiding, but the words stayed stuck. Instead, I just nodded, silently begging her to keep going. She sighed deeply, her shoulders sinking as if carrying a weight she'd held for years. "You've only ever known me as your mom," she whispered, "but before that, I was just a woman with dreams, mistakes, and feelings that didn't always fit into the neat little box people wanted me to live in. I've loved differently than what people expect." Her words sent a chill down my spine, because for the first time, she wasn't talking to me as my mother. She was talking as herself, as a human being trying to peel back layers she had buried for too long. I stared at her, trying to piece together what she was saying, though I already knew where it was leading. "Last night," I whispered without meaning to, my voice trembling, "I saw you. I saw you with her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Her face drained of color, and for a moment I thought she might deny it. But then, to my surprise, she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, almost as if she had been waiting for this confrontation. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she admitted softly. "You weren't supposed to see that." "Not yet. I wasn't ready for you to know. But I won't lie to you, not now. That woman, she means something to me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Anger, confusion, fear, and even a strange curiosity all tangled inside me. I wanted to yell at her for keeping secrets, for making me feel left out of her life. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the tenderness I had seen between her and that woman, a tenderness that didn't look wrong but still left me unsettled. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally asked, my voice breaking as the question escaped. "Why hide it from me?" She looked down, twisting her hands together as though she were ashamed. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what you'd think." Afraid of how you'd see me. Afraid that if I showed you this part of myself, I might lose you. And losing you is the one thing I could never survive. Her words hit me like a knife. I had always thought of her as fearless, a woman who could take on anything. But here she was, confessing the truth of her fear, not of the world, not of society, but of me, her own daughter. My anger melted into something else, something softer. I realized then that the secret wasn't about shame or deception. It was about love, her love for me and her fear of damaging the bond we shared. Still, I couldn't stop the hurt I felt. I don't know what to think, I whispered honestly, tears stinging my eyes. I've never thought about things like this. You and another woman. It feels like everything I thought I knew is different now. She reached for my hand, hesitating as if she wasn't sure I would accept it. Slowly, I let her fingers wrap around mine, the warmth of her touch grounding me even as my emotions swirled. Different doesn't mean wrong, she said gently, her voice steady now. Love isn't wrong, no matter what form it takes. I want you to understand that. I've spent so many years hiding, pretending, but I don't want to keep living that way. Not from you. Her words sank into me, heavy and confusing, but they also lit something inside me, a tiny spark of curiosity, a desire to understand her world instead of running from it. I realized she was asking me not just to accept her, but to see her fully, to recognize her as more than just the role she played in my life. I wanted to give her that, but it wasn't easy. The image of her with that woman was still fresh in my mind, a constant reminder that my reality had shifted overnight. Yet, as I sat there, holding her hand, I knew one thing, no matter how shaken I was, I didn't want to lose her either. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on to each other in the silence of the living room. The clock ticked steadily in the background, the world moving on as if nothing had changed, but for us, everything had. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'll answer any question you have, she promised. I'll tell you everything. I don't want to hide anymore. Not from you. My chest tightened at her words, and for the first time since last night, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe this wasn't just about secrets or betrayal. Maybe it was about learning, about understanding, about growing into a new version of ourselves that included truths I hadn't been ready to face. I looked into her eyes, and for the first time, I saw not just my mother, but a woman who had been fighting battles in silence. And I realized that if she was brave enough to open up, then maybe I could be brave enough to listen. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken words, as though the walls of our house carried secrets too fragile to let loose. I moved through each morning with my mind clouded, replaying the conversation we'd had, her voice echoing in my head with its tremors of honesty and fear. I wanted to believe her when she said love wasn't wrong, but years of unspoken rules from the world around me made it hard. People at school threw cruel jokes around without thinking, mocking anything that didn't fit their narrow view. I couldn't help but wonder if that was why my mother had been so afraid to let me in. I began to notice her in a different light. When she came home from work, tired and carrying the weight of responsibility, I also saw in her a woman who carried a second weight, the burden of being unseen for who she really was. She smiled at me the same way she always had, cooked dinner, asked about my homework, but I could feel her hesitations. She was waiting for me to say something, to ask, to open the door she had finally unlocked. But I stayed quiet, afraid of where my questions might lead. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch, staring at the fading sky as the sun melted into shades of pink and orange. She looked peaceful, yet her eyes held that same unspoken sadness I had begun to notice more and more. I sat beside her, hugging my knees to my chest, and for a while we didn't speak. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things we were both too cautious to put into words. Finally, she broke it. "You're angry with me, aren't you?" Her voice cracked as she asked, as though she had already prepared herself for rejection. I hesitated, then shook my head slowly. "Not angry," I said softly, "just confused." She nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Confusion is okay," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "I've lived in confusion most of my life. I don't want that for you." Her words stirred something inside me, something that made my heart ache. I realized then that this wasn't only about me discovering her truth. It was about her carrying years of silence, her identity buried under layers of duty and fear. And though I still didn't fully understand it, I knew I couldn't let her carry that alone anymore. "Tell me about her," I whispered, the words almost sticking in my throat. She turned to me, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment she didn't answer, maybe trying to decide how much to reveal. Then she sighed, her shoulders loosening as though she had been waiting for that exact invitation. "She's kind," my mother said softly. "She makes me laugh in a way I haven't laughed in years. With her, I don't have to pretend. I don't feel like I'm carrying the world on my back all the time. She sees me, all of me, and she doesn't turn away." The tenderness in her voice unsettled me at first, but as I listened, I saw something I had never truly seen in her before: happiness. Genuine, unguarded happiness. For so long, I had seen my mother as the strong, practical woman who worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, who never complained even when the weight of life crushed her. Hearing her speak about someone who made her feel light, who gave her space to just be herself, softened the knot of confusion inside me. Still, questions clawed at me. "Have you always been like this?" I asked cautiously. She thought for a long moment before answering. "I've always been me," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I didn't always have the courage to be honest about what that means. I grew up in a world where women like me didn't have a voice. I convinced myself it was easier to hide. Safer." Her words lingered in the air between us, heavy and raw. I tried to imagine what it must have been like, to live years of her life pretending, swallowing pieces of herself to fit into the mold people demanded. It made me wonder how much of her had been lost in silence. The more she spoke, the more I felt something inside me shifting. My confusion was still there, but it was joined by a new emotion: empathy. I could feel her pain, her loneliness, her quiet yearning to be accepted by the one person she loved most, me. It hurt to know I had been part of the reason she was so afraid, even if she had never said it outright. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, but this time the images in my head weren't filled with shock or betrayal. They were filled with questions about love, identity, and the parts of people we don't always see. I thought about how strong she had been, not just in raising me alone, but in carrying a truth she couldn't share. When morning came, I found her in the kitchen, humming quietly as she stirred a pot of coffee. For once, the heaviness between us felt a little lighter, though unspoken words still lingered. I walked up to her and hugged her from behind, pressing my cheek against her back. She froze for a second, then turned and wrapped me tightly in her arms. No words were exchanged, but in that moment, I hoped she understood what I was trying to say, that even if I was still learning, still struggling, I wasn't going anywhere. The following week carried a strange mixture of normal routines and quiet discoveries. School, chores, and homework still demanded my attention, but underneath it all there was a new rhythm at home, one shaped by the truth that had finally been spoken between us. My mother and I no longer danced around it, yet we didn't address it constantly either. It sat quietly in the background of our lives, like a new piece of furniture in a room. You couldn't ignore it, but you had to adjust to its presence. I noticed her differently now, in subtle ways I hadn't before. The way her face lit up when her phone buzzed with a message. The way she paused before answering, as though she wanted to hide the smile that crept onto her lips. I knew those messages weren't from a coworker or a friend in the casual sense. They were from her, the woman who had shifted everything. And instead of running from the thought, I found myself curious. I wondered what she was like beyond the pieces my mother had described. One Friday evening, I came home to find the house filled with the smell of cooking, but it wasn't my mother who was in the kitchen. My heart skipped when I saw her, short hair tucked neatly behind her ears, her sleeves rolled up as she stirred a pot on the stove. My mother was beside her, laughing quietly, her body relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. They both turned when they noticed me standing in the doorway, frozen, my backpack still slung over my shoulder. For a moment, no one moved. Then my mother's smile widened, though there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "this is Elena." The woman wiped her hands on a towel before stepping forward, her expression warm but cautious, as though she knew she was walking into fragile territory. "Hi," she said softly, her voice calm and kind. "It's really nice to meet you." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. My mother looked at me carefully, waiting for a reaction, ready to step in if things went wrong. My chest tightened with the weight of expectation, but I managed a small nod. "Hi," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The tension eased slightly, and my mother gestured for me to sit. Dinner was simple, pasta and salad, but it felt like the most complicated meal I had ever eaten. Every glance, every word carried more weight than usual. Elena tried to make conversation, asking about school, about the books I liked, about the little things that didn't feel threatening. Her presence was gentle, never forcing, never pushing too hard. Still, I couldn't shake the unease of seeing my mother so open with someone who wasn't me. For so long, it had just been the two of us, and part of me felt replaced, even if I didn't want to admit it. At one point, I caught the way Elena touched my mother's hand lightly, almost instinctively, and my stomach twisted with emotions I didn't know how to name. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but it was a strange sense of loss, as though I was no longer the center of her world. After dinner, I retreated to my room, my thoughts restless. A knock came a few minutes later, and my mother slipped in, sitting on the edge of my bed. She looked at me with that same searching gaze she always gave when she knew I was hiding something. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "It's weird," I admitted. "Seeing you like that. Seeing you, with her." She nodded slowly, not dismissing my feelings. "I know," she said softly. "It's new for you. It's new for me too, in a way. I don't want you to feel left out. You're still the most important person in my life." Her reassurance should have eased me, but the ache remained. "It just feels like everything's changing," I whispered. "Like I don't know where I fit anymore." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You fit right here," she said firmly. "Always. No one will ever take your place. But sometimes, our hearts have room for more than one kind of love. That doesn't mean you lose anything. It means we gain." Her words lingered long after she left my room, echoing in the quiet. I lay awake that night thinking about them, trying to untangle the knot of emotions inside me. I wanted to believe her, to trust that nothing between us would change, but deep down I knew it already had. Still, as confusing as it was, there was also a strange comfort in seeing her happy, in knowing she wasn't carrying her loneliness alone anymore. It didn't erase my fears, but it planted a seed of understanding I hadn't expected to feel. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what it might mean to truly accept this new chapter in both our lives. The days after that dinner settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange at the same time. Elena didn't come over every night, but when she did, her presence filled the house with a new kind of warmth. I noticed the way my mother's voice softened when she spoke to her, the way her laughter carried through the walls as though she had rediscovered a part of herself she had long buried. It was impossible not to notice the difference, and slowly, instead of resisting it, I found myself observing. I studied Elena in quiet moments, how she listened more than she spoke, how she always offered to help with dishes, how she seemed to pay attention to details about my mother that even I sometimes overlooked. She wasn't trying to take anything from me, she was simply trying to fit into the life we already had. Yet, that didn't erase the complicated feelings inside me. I found myself torn between relief that my mother was happy and fear that this happiness meant I had less space in her world. One Saturday afternoon, my mother asked me to join them for a walk in the park. I almost said no, afraid of the awkwardness, but something inside me nudged me to go. The air was crisp, leaves crunching under our feet, and the three of us walked side by side, though I kept a slight distance at first. Elena tried again to break through my walls, asking about school projects and the music I liked. I gave short answers, not out of rudeness, but because I wasn't sure how much I was ready to give. Yet, there was something about her patience, her willingness to wait for me to open up on my own, that began to soften my guard. At one point, I noticed how naturally she reached for my mother's hand, and instead of the pang of discomfort I had felt before, I caught myself watching the peace it brought my mother. Her shoulders relaxed, her steps lighter. For the first time, I realized how much she had carried alone all these years, and how desperately she needed someone to share the weight. Later that evening, when Elena had left and the house was quiet again, I sat with my mother at the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as we sipped tea, and I finally spoke the words that had been pressing on my chest. "She's nice," I admitted reluctantly, my fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. My mother's eyes widened slightly, then softened with relief. "That means more to me than you know," she whispered. I hesitated, then added, "I can see she makes you happy." The smile that broke across her face in that moment was one I hadn't seen in years, a smile of pure gratitude, as though I had lifted a burden from her shoulders simply by saying what she had been waiting to hear. But even as I said it, another feeling bubbled up inside me, a sense of fear I couldn't shake. Happiness was fragile. I had seen enough in life to know how easily it could be stolen, how quickly it could turn into pain. What if this love, this new version of my mother, came with consequences? What if people outside our home found out and treated her differently? Treated us differently? At school, I had heard the slurs, the laughter, the cruel jokes whispered about kids who didn't fit in. The thought of those same words being directed at my mother made my stomach twist. I wanted to protect her, but I didn't know how. That night, lying in bed, I wrestled with the questions I hadn't dared to voice. Could I handle the stares, the whispers, if people found out about her? Could I be strong enough to stand by her if the world turned cruel? I thought about her words, how love wasn't wrong, how different didn't mean broken. I wanted to believe them, but I knew the world outside our walls wasn't always kind. Still, as I drifted into restless sleep, one truth stayed with me: no matter how messy, confusing, or difficult it became, I couldn't turn away from her. She was my mother, and her happiness mattered to me more than my fear. The following morning, I found her already awake, sitting at the table with a notebook open. She looked up when I walked in, smiling softly. "I was just writing," she said, closing the cover. "Sometimes it helps me make sense of everything." I sat across from her, studying her tired but content face, and in that quiet moment, I realized we were both learning. She was learning how to live openly after years of silence, and I was learning how to accept that the woman I loved most in the world could also love in ways I hadn't expected. Neither of us had all the answers, but we had each other, and maybe that was enough for now. I began to notice how much had shifted inside me without even realizing it. Where there had once been only shock and confusion, there was now a strange sense of calm, though it was fragile and easily shaken. My mother carried herself differently these days. It wasn't dramatic, not something most people would notice, but I could see it. There was a lightness in her steps, a softness in her voice, even in the way she carried the groceries into the kitchen or hummed to herself while washing dishes. For so long, she had moved like someone weighed down by an invisible chain, and now it was as if she had finally loosened some of its grip. Seeing her like that was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because she deserved it, unsettling because I wasn't sure what it meant for US.AT school. I caught myself withdrawing from conversations with my friends. They gossiped about who was dating who, laughed about crushes, and teased each other about love notes and Valentine's cards. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I thought about my mother and Elena, about how real and tender their connection seemed compared to the shallow drama of high school relationships. It made me feel older than I was, as though I had been thrown into a world of truths my friends couldn't possibly understand. But with that awareness came fear too. I had heard the cruelty that slipped so easily from their mouths, the way they mocked kids who were even suspected of being different. I wondered what they would say if they knew about my mother. The thought made my chest tighten until it was hard to breathe. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. I heard laughter from the living room, and when I peeked inside, I saw them together again, my mother and Elena, curled up on the couch, watching an old movie. My mother's head rested on Elena's shoulder, her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her face. For a moment, I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or slip away. But then Elena noticed me and smiled warmly, not moving or pulling away, as though my presence didn't need to break the moment. My mother opened her eyes, and instead of guilt or panic, there was only openness. She didn't scramble to explain, didn't hide. She simply said, "You're home early," her voice gentle. Something inside me shifted then, seeing that she wasn't ashamed anymore, not even in front of me. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at the patterns in the wood as my mother poured us both tea. The warmth of the cup in my hands grounded me as I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks. "Doesn't it scare you?" I asked quietly. "What people might say. What they might think." She sat down across from me, her expression thoughtful. "Of course it scares me," she admitted. "People can be cruel. I've seen it, I've felt it. But hiding from who I am hasn't protected me either. It only made me lonelier. At some point, you have to decide what kind of pain you're willing to live with, the pain of being judged, or the pain of never being yourself." Her words hit me hard. I thought about all the times I had felt out of place at school, the moments I had swallowed my feelings just to fit in. If hiding small pieces of myself felt unbearable, how heavy must it have been for her to hide something so fundamental? I didn't have an answer, but I knew her courage stirred something in me, even if I wasn't ready to admit it. I wanted to be strong like her, but I was still afraid. That night, I lay awake again, listening to the faint sound of her laughter drifting from the living room as she spoke with Elena on the phone. I realized I didn't feel jealous anymore. Instead, I felt a strange kind of pride. Pride that my mother was brave enough to chase happiness, pride that she was teaching me, without meaning to, what it meant to live honestly. It didn't erase the fear, but it gave me something to hold on to, a quiet reassurance that maybe love, in its truest form, could outlast the world's harshness. As the days went by, I started to let myself join their conversations more, not just as an observer but as part of their world. Elena didn't push, she allowed me to come closer in my own time. And slowly, I realized that maybe this wasn't about losing my mother to someone else. Maybe it was about all of us building something new together, fragile but real. The change crept in so slowly that I didn't notice it at first, but by the time autumn came, our home no longer felt like it belonged only to my mother and me. It carried a new energy, one that came from Elena's presence. She wasn't there every day, but her influence lingered even when she was gone. A book she had been reading sat on the coffee table, a scarf forgotten on the back of a chair, the smell of her perfume faint on the couch cushions. At first, these things made me uneasy, as though she was leaving footprints in a place that had always been sacred for just the two of us. But over time, I began to see them differently. They weren't signs of intrusion, they were signs of someone who cared enough to leave a part of herself behind. And though I hadn't admitted it out loud, I had started to care too. Still, the outside world remained a shadow that hung over me. At school, my friends joked and laughed as always, but I felt distant from them, carrying a secret I didn't know how to share. I caught myself listening more carefully to the way people spoke about others, about difference, about love that didn't fit their expectations. Sometimes, I wanted to defend the nameless people they mocked, but the fear of their judgment kept me silent. I hated myself for that silence, hated how cowardly it made me feel. And every time, I thought of my mother, of how brave she had been to stop hiding even though she knew the risks. It gnawed at me that I couldn't show that same strength. One evening, Elena came over for dinner, and instead of retreating to my room afterward as I had done so many times before, I stayed in the living room with them. We played a board game, something lighthearted, and for the first time, I laughed with them. Not the polite laugh I had used before, but a genuine laugh that surprised even me. My mother's eyes lit up at the sound, her smile brighter than I had seen in years. Elena grinned too, though she didn't make a big deal of it. She simply kept playing, as if my laughter belonged there all along. Something loosened in my chest that night, as though a wall I had been building without meaning to had finally cracked. Later, after Elena had left, my mother pulled me into a hug in the kitchen. It wasn't the usual quick embrace, it was long and tight, filled with unspoken gratitude. "You don't know how much that meant to me," she whispered into my hair. I didn't answer right away, but I clung to her, realizing that maybe I did know. It meant everything. It meant she no longer had to choose between the woman she loved and the daughter she cherished. It meant we were finding a way to coexist, to build something together without losing what we already had. But acceptance didn't mean the fear disappeared. It was still there, lingering in the background. I worried about family members finding out, about neighbors whispering, about the possibility of people treating us differently. I worried about how it might affect me at school, how my friends would react if they discovered the truth. These thoughts piled up in the quiet hours, making me restless. One night, I confessed it to my mother. We sat together on my bed, the room dark except for the glow of the lamp. My voice shook as I admitted, "I'm scared of what people will say. About you. About us." She listened without interruption, her hand resting gently on mine. When I finished, she said something that would stay with me forever. "People will always have something to say. Some will understand, some won't. But what matters is what we know here, in our hearts. We know it's love. We know it's real. That has to be enough." Her words didn't erase the fear, but they gave me courage. They reminded me that truth was never easy, but it was worth holding on to. And slowly, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could face whatever came our way, as long as we faced it together. The first snow of winter came quietly one morning, blanketing the streets in white and softening the world outside our window. I woke up to the muffled sound of my mother moving around in the kitchen, her voice low as she spoke on the phone. I recognized the warmth in her tone immediately. It was Elena. For a moment, I lay there listening, not out of intrusion but because that voice, that gentleness, had become part of my life too. I realized then how much had changed since the night I had stumbled upon their secret. Back then, I had felt betrayed, confused, and scared. Now, as I listened, I felt something else entirely. I felt peace. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother looked up from the counter, her cheeks flushed with happiness, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider watching her from a distance. I felt like I was part of her joy. She smiled at me, setting the phone aside. "Elena's coming over later," she said casually, almost as if it had always been this way. And instead of the knot of unease that used to form in my stomach, I found myself nodding. "Okay," I said simply, and I meant it. That evening, Elena arrived with a bag of groceries, insisting she wanted to cook dinner for us. We crowded into the kitchen, the three of us moving around each other, chopping vegetables, setting the table, sneaking tastes from the pot. It felt natural, easy in a way I never thought it could. At one point, Elena handed me a spoon and asked for my opinion on the sauce, and I found myself laughing at her exaggerated reaction when I approved. My mother watched us with a quiet smile, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of pride and relief. I knew she had been waiting for this, for me to not just accept Elena, but to welcome her into our lives. And I knew then that she finally had it. After dinner, we sat in the living room, sipping tea as snowflakes drifted past the window. The conversation moved effortlessly, from stories of my mother's childhood to Elena's funny tales about her work, and even to my own dreams for the future. For the first time in months, I spoke openly, without hesitation, without the weight of confusion pressing on me. I realized how much lighter everything felt when I allowed myself to stop fighting what I didn't understand and instead leaned into the truth that had been in front of me all along. Love, no matter its form, was never something to fear. Later that night, after Elena had gone home, my mother and I sat together in the quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the heater. She reached for my hand, holding it tightly. "I need you to know something," she said softly. "No matter what happens, no matter who's in my life, you will always be my first home. You are the reason I learned how to love without giving up. Don't ever think for a second that you've lost me." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I leaned against her, feeling the steady beat of her heart. "I don't feel like I've lost you anymore," I whispered. "I think I've just found more of you." The tears came then, not just hers or mine, but both of ours. They weren't tears of fear or sadness this time. They were tears of release, of acceptance, of finally stepping into a truth that had been waiting for us all along. In that moment, I understood that what I had witnessed months ago wasn't the end of the world, but the beginning of one. It was the unveiling of who my mother truly was, and through her courage, I had learned something about myself too, that love is bigger than fear, and family is stronger when it is honest. As the snow continued to fall outside, I knew that life wouldn't always be easy. There would be whispers, judgments, and challenges. But I also knew we had built something unshakable within those walls, a bond that had been tested and had only grown stronger. My mother had found love, and I had found a deeper understanding of her, of us, of what it means to truly see someone. And though the world outside might not always be kind, inside our home, there was love. And that, I realized, was enough.